On one hand, some say we're in the Atari crash 2.0. But on the other hand, we're seeing an unprecedented success for indie games, establishing themselves as a legitimate competitor to even the biggest companies with games as simple as the commonly cited example of Balatro. But within that, would even a single person say we're in an actual golden age of gaming comparable to the 90s or even the early to mid-O's? So you get this situation with indie games where you'll get even monstrously, acclaimed and selling games like Hollow Knight. And within the praise and the sales and all that, you will see, not uncommonly, a very specific type of criticism about how the game just feels kind of empty or pointless or random or just not interestingly designed. You might just write this off as someone just not liking the game. But would even a single person, would you ever find even a single person say about a game like Ocarina of Time or Mario 64? No, obviously not. Like, even if they were to criticize the gameplay for maybe being too childish or, outdated in some way, would anyone say that the Spirit Temple doesn't have a vibe, the Forest Temple doesn't? No, you're never going to see that. In fact, you'll, to this day, see the precise opposite. You'll see videos that get, sometimes incredible views asking, why was this so interesting? You can cut out any piece of OOT or Mario 64. And obviously not just these games. These are just, some of the most remembered ones. Plenty where that came from. So why do these stand the test of time in that regard? While no one's gonna cut out a piece of Hollow Knight after the golden age of lore pondering, or whatever you want to call it, theory crafting, after that passes, is it gonna be Hollow Knight in 15 years that people are looking back on and wondering why it's so freaking mysterious? No, obviously not. It's still gonna be OOT. It's still gonna be Mario 64. So it lies in two things above all else: art direction and narrative. So, am I saying that all indie games are made by people who are not skilled at art? No, I'm not saying that. Am I saying that all indie games are made by people who can't write good stories? Kind of. Let's pull up an example for what I mean as a art direction example. If we take the recent Mouthwashing, this is definitely one of the more interesting games on the market. I mean, just from a, raw appearance standpoint, from a game feel standpoint. You don't even have to touch the controller to see that. But the thing about it, what is it that makes you look at this game and know, oh, this is indie? What is it that gives it that quality of derivativeness, or, for lack of a more flattering word, an element of cheapness? As opposed to if you were to put it next to our counter example in this case, Silent Hill 1. Well, the simple cop-out answer in this case would just be quality. Like, oh, it was just better artists on it. And obviously that's true, but that's really only part of the picture. And in fact, I would go as far as to say, even at the quality level that the people making Mouthwashing are at, they could have made something nearly as design-wise interesting as Silent Hill 1, even at the same art ability they had to work with. The problem comes in when we look at a common trend we see a lot. I see it especially a lot with aspiring game devs and learners and all that stuff, which is this kind of phenomenon of you're a pixel artist, or you're a game artist, or you're just a 3D artist. Are all of these real valid things? Yes. But are all these things that can actually just live on their own and not go back to the all-important idea of general artist? No. Obviously not. You have to go from here to here. And it's one of the reasons I'll cringe sometimes when people will get into game dev and whatever. It's almost like a sunk cost, where they just spend all their time learning essentially learning a bunch of heuristics to produce assets for their game, but they end up having to pay the price later because they're not getting efficient ROI on the time spent actually doing art, and then the quality and the actual design work will get bottlenecked at some point. And in some cases, you'll get people so comically delusional and detached from this reality that you'll get these like overhaul texture HD packs or whatever of old games. And you'll get people who put real time into this. And it just looks fucking atrocious because they're not real artists. The reality is that this is just not a thing. You're not a pixel artist, you're not a 3D artist. You're first and foremost, you're a general artist and designer. Silent Hill was derived from Takayoshi Sato's art, and it wasn't just him up and saying, I want to make games one day. He's a master at just normal drawing and designing, and from that, they then crunched it down into the graphics of the actual game and figured out how to translate it. That's what makes it feel good. You might have seen Silent Hill as a kid and just went, oh, this is freaking realistic. This is just some general idea of realism. This doesn't exist. There's no such... You need an actual sophisticated art style, and you will lose points, you will lose depth, you will lose a sense of actual character and world the more that this is lacking, the more the actual core intent is lacking. Now, what do you know? Not coincidentally, the same thing actually applies to the narrative side. Now, if you're going to think of a story like OOT, I mean, maybe some people with, nostalgia goggles might just say it's an amazing story or whatever. But the thing is, if you actually look at it, it's like, obviously it's not too much of a story. Or is it? That's the thing. In my first devlog, I talked about the main trait of what I'm trying to accomplish with Orc Castle. And I came up with the slogan, everything is narrative. And obviously that's significant to what I'm making because I'm actually promising like a visual novel tier, proper fleshed out story and all that. It's not going to be like something like Ocarina of Time or whatever. But is this principle of everything is narrative, is that actually unique to what I'm creating? Well, the answer is actually no. All classic games that were actually interesting and high quality and gave you that feeling like, oh my god, what's up with Peach's Castle? What am I missing in this world? It feels like every copy is freaking personalized, whatever. That came from this philosophy. That didn't come from anywhere else. So the thing is, the way it works is that the narrative and the art component are not actually fundamentally different by nature. They both are the product of compression. So what this means is you have normal narrative principles and you have normal art, and then what happens is these two get crunched down, and then from that is derived all the 3D, the pixel shit, whatever you want to call it, the overall game feel, and even the gameplay scenarios, which I'll touch on in a sec. The art component, this one's obvious. It's just like, do normal art. Do normal art. This is why I stressed making normal high-res versions for everything that's going in my game. This is why I sat on the character designs for so long, making sure that they'd be good character designs in any format, etc. There's a serious, rigorous process that companies would go through when deciding things like, making a box art character, like, the playable character. They would run all sorts of like game feel tests. They would worry about how well the character stands out during this and that, blah, blah, blah. That was not optional. You can't skip that. You can't skip all those principles and expect that your game's gonna feel like Mario. Now, on the narrative side, this is where things get a little more interesting. To understand this, you have to really break down and understand exactly what narrative is. And at its most essential, it turns out that narrative is really movement and mood. And what do I mean by these? So the thing is movement is really just progression. It's change. Mood is exactly what it sounds like. Just look up what mood means in a dictionary. It's a state that you can describe with words. It's a state of feeling that you can cleanly and articulately describe in words. So as long as you have change and you have clear defined moods, you actually have narrative. And extremely skillful use of these two things alone, you can actually discard the complexity of an overarching story, and you can actually get something that feels incredibly deep. And that's why Super Mario 64, which just amounts to Mario literally just kind of going through some like fever dream shit to rescue Peach. Why does that feel so good? It's because of these two things. It's the same reason OOT's extremely bare bones story feels so good. For example, did you notice that every single level up through the first Bowser fight in Mario, that there's a constant rhythm and motif of the summit or the bottom? Literally go back and take a look and see if you notice these things. That's your first hint. Then once you reach Bowser, you'll notice Bowser in the dark. Take a look at the background and tell me what you see. Look at the skybox and notice how you get these big stalagmites or stalactites, whatever the fuck they're called. And you get ones that are up and down. They span the top and the bottom. They are symmetrical. There's a symmetry. There's a lack of sense of ground and ceiling. You have to climb all the way up to get to the warp pipe. But once you go in the warp pipe, at the top, Mario spits out down onto the Colosseum where he fights Bowser. Thus, we sort of reach a climax of this up-down concept. This is one of the key ingredients. This is the platform, these motifs, these ideas. These are the platforms for movement and mood to establish itself. This is what creates a sense of meaning. There's this common idea that comes up a lot in Western storytelling of like world building. And a lot of the time, I just recommend to people to just literally kill it. Like, you want meaning. No one wants your bullshit, you know? Like, go ahead and like tell someone about like your random imaginations or your random like dreams you had or something. They're gonna make you stop real quick. Yet when they play Mario 64, it's gonna be absolutely mesmerizing for them. And yet you might think, oh, Mario's whimsical and random. No, it's the meaning. You can see this a lot, especially when it comes to designing things like magic systems and, you know, world lore and like what monsters are in it, what can the characters do. There's a really aggressively like whimsical or random kind of quality to when people develop games and they fill in like what the abilities are and all that shit. And you end up with this really weird, sometimes like surreal situations or character abilities where this guy's like, you know, he's like a chef, but for some reason he can air dash and he wants to climb a mountain for some reason, and they just throw some random story on that no one gives a shit about, but everyone wants to praise just because the frickin' game sold or something, you know. It's just like after the fact. It's like, if this is what classic games were made like, no one would have liked them, no one would have remembered them. Atari Crash 1.0 would have never, that would have been the end of video games. And see, this is where there's a huge advantage to having a concrete narrative, like actually having a super good writer on the team, because we don't have Nintendo's whole UX testing, rigorous $1 billion team that made Mario 64. We just have like ourselves and maybe a few other people. So the thing is you can't discover these things through trial and error. You can't brute force your way into these things. You have to have someone on the team who is extremely skilled with creating narrative. And that's why, I mean, for me, that's literally myself. That's what I'm doing. And that's why, like, when I'm making, like, the moves characters use in my game, when I'm coming up with, like, the symbol, like, first of all, what types there are, period. And then, like, coming up with, like, what symbols represent them and stuff. What does each one do? That's not me having fun. That's not me just, like, going back to a childish mind and asking, like, what like Chunibyo powers would I want and stuff. That's not that. I never add a single move to the game. I never come up with a spell. I never animate anything without asking, okay, I literally have a story here. There's scenes in the story. There's a plot flow here. It's all there already. How does this feel? How does it feel with the context of all these scenes and these characters with defined personalities? Does it feel good? If it doesn't, okay, come up with something else. That's how you're going to get these things to look good. That's how you're going to get literally just visual symbols that just look meaningful, because you're putting it in a web of meaning. You're putting it in a web of larger motifs with larger moods. And this This is why Pokemon Red and Blue just captured so many people's hearts. Again, same principle as Ocarina of Time and Mario 64. The Pokedex was full of motifs and a Moodle progression. And that's something that honestly it's worth like a 5-hour analysis, which I'm highly considering actually doing. So now let's address the elephant in the room, perchance. Undertale. Here's one that you might kind of think of as an exception. Like, doesn't Undertale kind of capture the magic of classic games? Some people would say maybe it did it even better than a lot of them. Well, here's the thing. There's first and foremost 2 key reasons this happened. The first is a really oddly overlooked one, and it's actually just Temmie. Temmie was freaking huge on this game. She designed pretty much everything. She did the concept art, she did a lot of this writing, and it was all just going off of a few vague instructions. It's not an understatement to say that she, in many parts of the game, is more the game than Toby, and she's just a very skilled artist with like good taste. Especially too was sensitive to the types of things Toby was like thinking about at the time, such as like classic games and stuff like Toho and stuff, and a lot of that feel entered the game, and especially is one of the reasons it really clicked with Japan, because they can feel that. They can feel the game being the product of all those things going through actual proper art and then getting crunched down into the actual game. The second thing here is actually motif, not light. For once, it's not light. It's not the light motif. Toby wasn't a real writer or anything when he wrote Undertale. He just used his good sense, mostly derived from making music, and the fact that he did have some EXP in writing, to wing it. However, there was one thing that he kind of almost scientifically had a strong grasp of, almost like a normal, proper professional writer would, and it was actually motifs. He understood that if you lace motifs throughout the game, it naturally will create a platform for moods to develop. And if you look and pay attention to some of the interviews and stuff, he'll actually mention them explicitly at times. Like, for example, the Holy Trinity. He says, oh, in Undertale, everything comes in threes. You know, it's significant. It's like the Father, Son, Holy Spirit type concept. And if you look, it's actually very consistent about it. He doesn't miss opportunities to lay threes out. And he doesn't not understand the kind of mysterious mood that creates. He doesn't not understand that that creates a tension between like higher things, lower things, you know, middle things, whatever. Like, he understands the properties of these motifs. Did Hollow Knight do this? No, it didn't. They admitted it. They admitted themselves that when they added to Hollow Knight, it was a 15-minute meeting that wrapped up and they just shoved whatever idea they came up with in the game immediately. That's why people will say that Hollow Knight can feel like a whole lot of nothing. But again, even the haters wouldn't say this about Undertale. And the haters definitely won't say it about Orc Castle. A quick moment to express infinite thanks to the people who have engraved their names into otaku history, including our legendary Oda King. It would have been quite literally impossible to get the project to this point without all of their support. My next goal is to hit 1,000 on the Patreon. I won't lie, things will get a little rocky if we can't reach that this month because I've been sacrificing literally everything for this project. But if you're not subscribed to the Oda Clinic, what the fuck do you think about all day? All irony aside, this thing low diffs every other art learning program on the internet, and for a tiny fraction of the cost. We're getting close to like 40 hours of content with info I specifically chose to be hard or even impossible to find elsewhere. On top of that, the playable battle simulator will be dropping very soon, or maybe already has at the time you're watching, where you can play the battles I'm describing here. And it'll rapidly have characters and moves added over the next few weeks. Orc Castle Chapter 1 is going to be as large as some popular full-release indie games, and with your help, I'll be able to get it out within several weeks. So go to the link and engrave your name in otaku history. Colties, 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 Colties.
I'm gonna start screaming.